paper reports that two of the male prostitutes were given a late-night tour of the White House last year.
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers.
I want the truth.
You can't handle the truth.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Nick Bryant podcast. Today, my guest is Francis Richard Conolly. And he made a documentary that got over 1 million views called JFK to 9/11. Everything is a Rich Man's Trick. And he followed it up with a book of the same title. How are you doing today, Francis?
I'm great, Nick. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. You start off your movie by talking about Smedley Butler. And I don't know if a lot of Americans know about Smedley Butler, but the banksters decided to have a revolution when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected. And Smedley Butler was held in very high esteem by the military. So the banksters went to Smedley Butler and said, can you lead the revolution against Roosevelt and the New Deal? And Smedley Butler told the Roosevelt administration what was going on. And that was a very interesting interlude in American history because nothing really happened to the banksters, even though Smedley Butler had told the Roosevelt administration that they were engaged in high treason.
Very, very much so. Yeah, that whole episode, Nick, was that was such an episode in my own life because I discovered Smedley Butler about a year before we actually made the movie, during the writing, and I thought at the time that I was simply going to have to illustrate that moment with pictures of him and just talk about him. And then I started seeing on YouTube that there were public comments that were obviously put out by the military, by the CIA, by the FBI, whoever. They were saying, oh, no. Let's understand what's going on here. Smedley Butler didn't really understand what was going on, and he wasn't the genius that people have made him out to be, etc., etc., etc. Some wonderful person who must have had, I think, very high access somewhere up in the American National Archives somewhere, must have seen this, absolutely must have done, and said, whoa, here's the American establishment lying to the people. So I know where this piece of film is, I'm going to put it out, and put a YouTube video out that was Smedley Butler detailing what you've just said, that he was, they tried to hire him to lead 500,000 men to impose fascism upon the United States in 1934. And that being the wonderful man that he was and the true believer in democracy, the true American that he was, he refused. And that was a very, very significant piece of history, I believe, that I'm so grateful. The person who did that, maybe their name will never be known, and it's so tragic. If you could find out who it was who did it, I'd love to know who put that videotape out, because it was so important in the development of my film, and then the development of the writing at that point. I mean, the writing, I think, would have taken me a lot longer to really get it across how important it was to have Smedley Butler himself in my movie saying, this is what happened. That it was just fantastic.
I'd never seen that footage before I watched the movie. So that was pretty interesting.
That's great. That's great to know.
I'd known about Smedley Butler for a long time, and we're long overdue. A movie should be made about his life, because he was truly a hero on multiple levels.
Absolutely a hero.
And then you talk about the banksters trying to hire Smedley Butler to foment a revolution. And then your movie and your book get into the American corporations that backed the Nazis. And a lot of people might not be familiar with how many American corporations backed the Nazis. In your movie and also in your book, you talk about tetraethyl lead gasoline, which is
I couldn't say it either. Tetraethyl lead,
which powered the Luftwaffe, and the only three people or the only three companies that the Germans could get that formula from was DuPont, General Motors, and Standard Oil. Those were the only three companies. So obviously in your, I believe in your documentary and in your book, you say that Standard Oil is the guilty party.
Well, the important thing for your audience to take from this section, I think, Nick, is that not only were all of those corporations you've mentioned most definitely Nazi in their outlook. The thing that's been great about this is that since my movie went out and had such a huge impact on the world, fans have been writing to me from everywhere, and they've been saying, well, Mr. Conolly, did you know that Siemens and Porsche and Mercedes and BMW and this German corporation, that German, that they were all involved as well? People even wrote to me, there were several different people who wrote to me and said, did you know that Hugo Boss made the uniforms? So what you had in the end was this vision, I think, that people now have, sort of soaked up and absorbed, that you have the whole of German industry really using Nazi slave labor, and that they're all guilty together. I think that's very important that people know that, because to this day, I still don't think, even though there have been reparations, especially to the Jews who were involved, Jewish families, I still don't think that those who were guilty of using slave labor have been as forthright about it as they ought to be. In my view, the whole thing, in spite of my movie, is still. I mean, I don't know if you feel the same, but it still feels to me like it's rather under wraps, and the people responsible for it still haven't apologized and brought the whole thing out in the way that they ought to have done it, and in the same way that there should be a movie about Smedley Butler that children can look at in classes in school. I think that there should be an entirely new movie about exactly who Hitler's friends were. Before we went on air, we were talking about Professor Anthony Sutton, and I think that there should be a movie based on his work, because he wrote a book, I think it was called The Best Enemy That Money Can Buy, where he tried to detail the amount of American involvement with the Nazi Party. And it, as you say, it does form a very important part of the spine of my movie, if you like. And it is something which even now, literate Americans, and there are many of them, know about it. But I think that it's something that every American, certainly every American child should learn about, because it was such it's such an inversion on what is presented to us through the media. Since 1935, let's say, right up till the modern day, I still think that the average school child would say to you, "Oh, Hitler? Well, yeah. I mean, he was just like crazy little lunatic with a paintbrush mustache, and he was responsible for the Second World War." They might mention the Holocaust, and they might mention how long the Second World War went on and how many people died. And the truth is all about the American involvement, how much American money was invested in the Holocaust, in the slavery camps. That's the truth that still, to me, isn't coming out. And the British, I'll say this flat out, are more responsible, more guilty than anybody.
Well, British Shell had about at least 1,300, 1,400 forced laborers that worked at oil refineries and petrochemical plants that were not operated by the Nazis. And Ford provided vehicles and war production, and their subsidiaries in Nazi Germany also used slave labor. And IBM, this is kind of interesting, they provided punch cards that which were rudimentary computers to keep track of concentration camp capacity. And Merck, they were outright supporters of Hitler.
Yeah.
And also DuPont. The DuPonts were colluded with the Nazis during World War II. So you've got these major families, these oligarchs, these American oligarchs that are colluding with the Nazis.
Yes, exactly. I mean, you've spelled that out so beautifully. I'm not sure I would want to waste time adding to it. It is a very important point, though, I think. If people want to sort of look at this in a broadly philosophical way, to me, it really says something that the very first use of computers was to track people in the Holocaust. What does that say about us as a species, Nick?
Well, as a species, we're highly irrational. That's what I've come to believe.
Aren't we? Yeah.
And you also talk about Prescott Bush colluding with the Nazis through Union Bank. Could you expand on that?
Oh, expand on Prescott Bush. Again, I think Americans, the most important thing that they need to know here was that his collusion with the Nazis was what led to him being able to finance this stream of his own family's presidencies. Had it not been for the money that he made, this is Prescott Bush, as a Nazi financier and a profiteer of slave labor, he wouldn't have been able to finance George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush's presidencies. He wouldn't have been able to do that. And I think that's something that's very important for Americans because of his Prescott Bush's involvement also with with Richard Nixon. But in order for the Americans to see the proof of that, I'd like them to see the proof of that, which is in my movie.
You also talk about Standard Oil being in partnership with IG Farben, which provided.
It's just for your viewers' edification, Nick. They say IG Farben. That's how. If anybody's bothered, that's how the Germans pronounce it. IG Farben.
I'm not a German, and I live in New York, so I don't have to worry about enunciations. But talk about Standard Oil and Farben.
Well, again, it was that came about because IG Farben and the Germans generally, they were looking at synthetic oil, and they didn't have the kind of oil that was necessary to to get the entire fleet of what the all the planes and all the trucks and tanks, etc., that the Germans had, the Nazis had. They didn't have the oil reserves that were necessary. So if it hadn't been for Standard Oil coming in and giving the Germans all so much fuel for nothing, the German war machine would have ground to a halt. Again, this is something that I need need people to understand is that if you ask, how does this army fight this battle, and how did they have this victory and that victory? Everybody who's any kind of military strategist knows, for one thing, that an army marches on its stomach, and somebody's got to feed them, somebody's got to provide the uniforms, and most importantly, in in this world now, technologically, you've got to have something to fuel the vehicles. And Germany didn't have its own oil supply. They had to, be helped by somebody, and it was Standard Oil who helped them by giving them, as I say, millions of tons of crude oil for nothing. So again, it's glad you brought that up. It's a very important part of American history that you'll never hear in a classroom, I'm sure.